The year is 2020. Eddie Van Halen is gone. And in the deafening silence left by his passing, a 70-year-old Michael Anthony finally breaks his silence, revealing a truth that shatters the fairytale image of rock's greatest party band. For decades, he was the smiling bassist in the shadows, the forgotten backbone of a billion-dollar machine. But now, he's exposing the betrayal that ended it all. The painful reality of a brotherhood torn apart by ego. And the heartbreaking reason he'll never get to say goodbye. Before we uncover what really happened, tell us in the comments, what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding about this story? For decades, the image was perfectly crafted. For musicians, bound by a brotherhood forged in the fire of Southern California's backyard party scene, living out the ultimate rock and roll fantasy. The smiles, the high kicks, the effortless chemistry on stage had all pointed to a band that had found the secret to surviving fame's relentless pressure. Michael Anthony, the bassist with the unmistakable grin, stood in the shadows of Eddie Van Halen's guitar wizardry, the steady heartbeat that allowed the magic to happen. And for a long time, even through the lineup changes, the drama, and the excess, he believed the fairy tale was real. He believed the brotherhood would withstand anything. Then, in 2006, the fairy tale ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet announcement. Eddie Van Halen revealed that his son, Wolfgang, would be taking over on bass. Anthony, the man who had anchored the band's rhythm section since 1974, learned of his own firing from the press. He discovered the news online, reading it alongside millions of fans. There was no final conversation, no mutual understanding. Just a cold, public replacement that severed a 32-year bond without a single word exchanged. For years, the official story was that Anthony had quit. But behind the scenes, a far more painful truth was about to surface, a truth that would redefine everything the public thought they knew about Van Halen's final years. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe so you never miss our next documentary. To understand the depth of Michael Anthony's pain, you have to go back to the very beginning. He joined Van Halen in 1974, walking into a rehearsal garage where Eddie and Alex Van Halen had already forged a musical bond unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was the brothers and everybody else, as Anthony would later put it, an unbreakable fortress that he would spend the next 3 decades trying to enter. And yet, for all the friction, those early days felt like a fairy tale. The backyard parties. The climb from Pasadena to global superstardom. Anthony was the steady anchor, the smiling bassist whose high harmonies became as essential to the Van Halen sound as Eddie's guitar. But as the band's success grew, so did the divisions. When Sammy Hagar joined in 1985, the dynamic shifted into 2 distinct camps, the Van Halen brothers on one side, and Hagar and Anthony on the other. It wasn't just creative differences, it was as simple as smoking versus non-smoking. Everything was smoking or non-smoking, Anthony recalled. It came down to what buses you rode on or the dressing rooms. What seemed trivial on the surface masked something deeper. Eddie and Alex were inseparable, and in that fortress, Anthony was always the outsider. Even after decades of loyalty, he was never truly family. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. By 2004, Van Halen had been dormant for 6 long years. The disastrous experiment with Gary Cherone was a distant memory, and fans were desperate for a return to glory. On paper, a reunion with Sammy Hagar made perfect sense. But behind closed doors, the cracks were already forming, and they started with Michael Anthony. Eddie Van Halen didn't want him on that tour at all. The guitarist's resentment toward Anthony's friendship with Hagar had festered for years. And yet, Hagar refused to agree to anything unless Anthony was included. So Anthony signed a humiliating contract. He took a massive pay cut. He relinquished any claim to the Van Halen name and logo. He swallowed his pride because he believed this might be the band's final bow. "I didn't need the money. I decided to suck it up because I thought if this was the last time Van Halen was performing, I wanted to be out there with them and with the fans," he later explained. He was willing to sacrifice everything for one last ride. What he didn't anticipate was the nightmare that awaited him. When Sammy Hagar reunited with Eddie in person for the first time in nearly a decade, he was horrified. Eddie looked like he hadn't bathed in a week. He was missing teeth, the ones he had left were black. His boots were held together with gaffer's tape, his big toe poking through. He was hunched over like an old man, a third of his tongue removed due to cancer, speaking with a lisp. This was not the guitar god Hagar remembered. This was a man in crisis. The tour became a battlefield. Eddie's substance abuse was so severe that performances were sloppy, sometimes nearly incoherent. The tension was unbearable. Hagar and Anthony barely spoke to Eddie backstage. The brothers flew on one jet, Hagar and Anthony on another, just to keep the peace. Eddie grew paranoid over Hagar's Cabo Wabo tequila promotions, even demanding radio stations not mention it in the same sentence as Van Halen. He did the same with Anthony's hot sauce. Every night was a survival test. When the tour finally limped to its conclusion in Tucson, Arizona, in November 2004, Eddie smashed his guitar on stage. It was a symbolic end. They went their separate ways. Hagar hasn't spoken to Eddie since. And Anthony believed he'd made his peace with the band. But 2 years later, the final blow would arrive, and not in a conversation, but in a headline. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe so you never miss our next documentary. 4 years after the 2004 tour, Michael Anthony held on to a quiet hope. Despite the bitter contract he signed, despite the fractured relationship with Eddie Van Halen, he believed the story wasn't over. He believed the brotherhood would eventually find its way back together. But in 2006, that hope was extinguished in the cruelest way imaginable, not through a conversation, not even through a phone call, but through the cold, impersonal glow of a computer screen. When Eddie Van Halen announced that his 15-year-old son Wolfgang would be replacing Anthony on bass, Anthony learned about it online alongside millions of fans. There was no warning. No explanation. No final conversation that honored 32 years of shared history. If I was dead and they needed someone to play, that's one thing, Anthony later told Rolling Stone, but to me this is not a reunion. The statement landed with devastating precision. It wasn't just about losing a job, it was about being erased from a legacy he helped build. And yet, even in that moment of profound betrayal, Anthony refused to let bitterness consume him. He understood what was really happening. Eddie, he wanted to play with his son, Anthony explained. He even went further, suggesting that Wolfgang probably wasn't excited about being in Van Halen at all, that he only did it for the chance to share a stage with his father. It was a remarkable act of empathy from a man who had every reason to be furious. But the regret lingered. And it still does. The only regret I have is how things, unfortunately, turned out for Van Halen, Anthony said in 2025. It should have gone out with a freaking bang that shook the world, and it was more like a whimper, the way everything ended. Decades of music. Countless sold-out arenas. A legacy that changed rock history. And yet, the final chapter was written not in triumph, but in silence. Years would pass before Anthony would learn that reconciliation was closer than anyone realized, and that Eddie, in his final days, had been planning something that would have changed everything. If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video and subscribe for more true celebrity stories every week. In the years after his dismissal, Michael Anthony quietly moved forward. He toured with Sammy Hagar, embraced his role as rock's most beloved underdog, and seemed to have made peace with his place in Van Halen's complicated history. But in 2018, everything changed. Management reached out to Anthony with an offer that would have rewritten the band's final chapter, a reunion stadium tour with the classic lineup, featuring David Lee Roth on vocals and Anthony back on bass, alongside Eddie and Alex Van Halen. It was the phone call he'd waited over a decade to receive. And according to those closest to Eddie, the guitarist was genuinely excited about it. Nuno Bettencourt, the extreme guitarist, recalled a meeting with Eddie in the final years of his life. Eddie spoke of reuniting with Anthony with enthusiasm, telling Nuno he wanted the band to go out the way they came in, together, guns blazing. It was the version of Eddie Van Halen that Anthony had always hoped existed beneath the pride and the pain. Plans were set in motion. Special guests like the Foo Fighters and Metallica were tentatively scheduled to join on select dates. But the cancer was spreading. Eddie's health was deteriorating faster than anyone realized. The stadium tour never materialized. Even then, there was still a chance for reconciliation. Wolfgang Van Halen revealed that his father had considered a kitchen sink tour that would have brought together Michael Anthony, Sammy Hagar, David Lee Roth, and even Gary Cherone. Wolfgang's plan was to personally reach out to Anthony, to mend the fractured relationship himself before the reunion could take shape. But someone got there first. Management contacted Anthony before Wolfgang had the chance to make that phone call. A small detail, perhaps, but one that spoke volumes about the miscommunication and missed opportunities that defined the band's final years. Anthony never spoke to Eddie again. We actually hadn't spoken, and unfortunately we didn't get a chance to. It kind of bothers me because we had some issues that were never resolved, he admitted. He believes that if Eddie hadn't passed when he did, they would have reconciled, they were on track for it. But Eddie's illness was a closely guarded secret. Anthony knew Eddie was ill, but the extent of it remained hidden until the very end. By the time the reality set in, it was too late. But that was only the beginning of a regret that would follow Anthony for years to come. The final chapter of this story isn't about anger. It isn't about bitterness. And it certainly isn't about revenge. For Michael Anthony, the truth he spent his 70s revealing is far more complex than a simple settling of scores. It's the truth of a man who loved his band, who gave 32 years of his life to something he believed in, and who watched it slip away not with a bang, but with a whimper so quiet it was almost cruel. In the years since Eddie's passing, Anthony has been remarkably generous in his public statements. He's spoken of Van Halen's peak as living the dream, a fairy tale, words that carry the weight of genuine affection, not hollow nostalgia. But it's his regrets that cut deepest. He's articulated them with an honesty that feels almost painful to witness. The only regret that I have is how things, unfortunately, turned out for Van Halen. It should have gone out with a freaking bang that shook the world, and it was more like a whimper, the way everything ended. That word whimper echoes through every interview he gives. It's not just a complaint about a missed opportunity. It's the lament of someone who knows that history will remember the final act more than the glory days. For a man who helped build one of rock's most iconic legacies, that's a truth that must sting every time he revisits it. And then there's the silence. The unresolved wounds. Unfortunately, Eddie and I never had a chance to really settle any differences that we had in the past, Anthony admitted. It's a statement that arrives with the weight of finality. He's spoken of a potential reunion that was on the table in 2018, a stadium tour that would have brought the classic lineup together one last time. He's confirmed that plans were being made and that Eddie, in his final days, seemed ready to let the past be the past. But the reconciliation never happened. Eddie was very private about how ill he was, Anthony explained. We all knew he was ill, but it was a real shock to all of us. The revelation that Wolfgang Van Halen intended to personally reach out to Anthony, but that management contacted him first, adds another layer of tragic miscommunication to an already fractured story. It's a small detail, but it speaks to a much larger pattern, a legacy defined by ego, pride, and the failure of simple human connection. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Michael Anthony's truth is its absence of malice. He's found closure where he could have with Wolfgang, at a concert in Las Vegas, where the two sat and talked and finally began to heal. He's defended Eddie's decision to play with his son, understanding that it was driven by a father's love rather than personal animosity. And he continues to honor the music, not by chasing bitterness, but by celebrating the moments when Van Halen truly was firing on all 12 cylinders. That's the legacy Michael Anthony has chosen. Not the drama. Not the betrayals. Not the whimper of a band that couldn't find its way back together. But the fairy tale, the moments when it worked, when the music soared, and when the brotherhood felt real. And as he approaches his 70s, that's the truth he's finally ready to share.